and welcome to 2000 AD's panel, which is, as you probably know, the 45th anniversary of 2000 AD. And we're not going to waffle on about it because you know why you're here. So I'm going to tell you we're joined by Ian Rankin, Louie Stowell, and Lauren Beukes. And I can tell you that you know Ian Rankin. He's an author. You know he's created Rebus. You know he's got an incredible collection of prog rock records. And I know that House has some Edgar Allan Poe awards, I think, as well. I hope I'm right saying that. Lauren Beukes written, again, remarkable work, short story writer, television writer, journalist, and had a story in 2000 AD's 40th anniversary issue. And Louie Stowell, I can just tell you that her latest novel is the next novel that I'm about to read. And I grabbed it off my son, who had it initially, but I decided I'm going to get through it quicker. So that new book is Loki. So hello, everyone.
Hey.
Right, hello. I'm going to start. I'll start off with you, Ian, because I think you probably, being even older than me on the panel, you were around when 2000 AD actually started, when it was first in the newsagents. When did you know about its existence?
Very early on. There weren't any bookshops in my village, but there was a newsagents, and I used to buy every comic going, starting off when I was very young with a Bimbo and stuff like that, and moving on to the Victor and the Hotspur, all the great DC Thompson titles, and then moving on to the Marvels and the DC comics. Irregularly, because you couldn't always, you might get one issue and then you'd go in the next week or next month and you couldn't find the one that came after it. So I had a lot of very incomplete stories and I had to fill in the gaps myself using my imagination. 2000 AD, I don't think I was around for issue 1. I don't know why I wasn't around for issue 1, but I certainly picked up on it pretty early on. It would be one of these things where you're in the playground. I was about 17 when it started. In the playground, somebody would have a copy, you'd borrow it from them, you'd read it, you'd say that is great. The next week you go and buy it.
Because I think the nearest, because I would have been 8 when it came out, and I think just before that, Action comic, which was quite that was beginning to move towards it. It was a big move away from Victor. It had kind of, you know, Jaws rip-offs, and I think probably got letters of complaint from various readers and listeners, kind of associations, because it was quite gory. Louie, what about for you? When was 2000 AD something that you noticed on the shelves?
So I didn't notice it on the shelves first. I noticed it in my house because my dad had a massive stack of them. So I think it would have been the mid-80s. I was about 6 or 7, I think, and I started diving into them. And around that time, also Richmond's first comic book shop opened up as well. And I remember going to visit there. It was called They Walk Among Us, sadly defunct, but it was great. And I think it was the Dark Judges story was the first one I ever read. That whole arc, and it just really sucked me in. And I think it was nothing like, I read the Beano and all that. I also read Oink. Anyone remember Oink?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I think 2000 AD, it had that combination of everything being hilarious, it also being quite satirical, which I really liked. I was quite a weird kid, and also the gore and the action. I loved Slain when they did the Blood Eagle and you got the ribs ripped apart. And I now write children's books, and I still feel really cross that I'm not allowed to put that sort of thing in children's books, because I read it when I was 6 and it was fine.
It's an interesting thing, Lauren. I don't know for you, whether when you start reading something like 2000 AD, for me, it felt like you were suddenly a bit more grown up. It felt like not only was the art also, I mean, I think that's a very important thing the art, if you look at the standards of a lot of art that was in comics, and especially the terrible annuals that used to come out and have very cheap art in it, this felt like, I'm pretty mature 8-year-old now. I'm kind of going into darker and stranger dystopian visions.
Absolutely. So, I was in South Africa where I grew up, and we were under sanctions, which meant that we very rarely got comics, as Ian experienced, wouldn't get comics regularly. So you wouldn't get every issue. So 2000 AD monthly for me was an absolute godsend, because here's the entire story from Bad Company to Slain to Nemesis the Warlock, Halo Jones, Strontium Dog, and to be able to get the full story without missing like 12 issues and then trying to make up what happened in between was absolutely amazing. And I also felt that it was very much, it was a very political comic in a way that the occasional issues of Amethyst or Spider-Woman or, Batman that I was able to get hold of intermittently were not. 2000 AD dealt with dystopian society. It dealt with totalitarianism. The Strontium Dog stories were such a great analog for what was happening under apartheid. And it really felt that this was something urgent and relevant and certainly resonant with kind of what my life experience was, and hella punk, and I did feel more grown up, definitely.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, as you said, I think the best science fiction is always looking at, well, in fact, as you were saying, Louie, about being interested in satire, there's a tremendous amount of satire in the best science fiction. There's a tremendous amount of reflecting on the world that you are in at any one time. And it feels to me that 2000 AD was a lesson for a lot of the great big comic book companies at the time. It seemed like quite a kind of, cheap, inky thing compared to, these wonderful, those comics where we'd see adverts for Twinkies inside them and all of these, and suddenly here was a British inky thing, which was filled with something that did feel a bit more visceral and certainly, as you said, more cutting edge as well. And that seems very important. And Louie, I mean, when you're writing, do you feel the hand of those comic books on your shoulder? Do you feel that imagination that you saw explored there?
Yeah, I think because 2000 AD was so many different worlds, it was space, it was the future, it was, Thatcher's Britain. It makes me feel in a hurry to write lots of different things. Like I want to pack it all in like 2000 AD did. But I think also I sort of feel a duty for children now to give them what I can do in terms of like quite a clear-sighted vision of at least how I see the world, and maybe get them to ask questions about how they see it. Because I think with 2000 AD, it was always asking questions like Judge Dredd, obviously the protagonist, but also a fascist. And I'm rooting for him and I'm confused. And I sort of want to be him, but also, oh no, he's really bad. And I think I like that discomfort. And I like that for readers as well, however, young or old they are.
That's an interesting thing, isn't it? That kind of sometimes sliding between fascism and socialism and other, which is what we see so much in the comic book industry. There are certain comic book writers that have got to late middle age, and you go, they've become the late middle age fascists. And then we have, one of the great 2000 AD writers, obviously Alan Moore, who I still consider to be, he's a good. If you're going to have someone as your kind of, ethical guidelines, I think Alan is still doing pretty well at whatever he is, 67 years old now. What about for you, Ian, in terms of this, as you said, the comic books that came before, they really did seemed like a revolution to, as an 8-year-old. There was nothing like this.
Yeah, and if you were the age that I was when I started reading it, which was, around about 77, 78, 16, 17, 18 years old, a time of punk, and you felt like a punk as well. Here was something that had a punk attitude to it. It didn't seem to give a damn. It was pushing boundaries all over the place. It was extraordinary. The visceral nature of some of the art, the visceral storytelling, the fact that it could be incredibly bleak, and yet this was a comic aimed at kids. And produced by just a handful of people. I mean, in later years, I've got to meet some of the people who were around at the very start, people like Alan Grant. And you realize there were only about 2 or 3 people working on this comic at any one time under a series of pseudonyms. So it looked like it was a much bigger staff than there actually was. And so there was a kind of punk mentality going on. It was a thing like, let's just get this done. Let's get it out there and see what happens. It's a bit like Sniffing Glue, the punk magazine, where they gave you 3 chords on the front of page 1 and said, now go and form a band. And so you got the feeling that you could have a go at this, you could try this. And at the same time, it felt very grown up. If you were, again, a teenager, if you got the references, you went, oh, look, Judge Dredd is going to Huntertwasserblock. He's an artist. I know that name. You felt suddenly very clever. I remember a couple of friends and me who were big 2000 AD fans, I think possibly our first year at university, when suddenly somebody said the words Rojaws and Hammerstein, and we went, it's Rodgers and Hammerstein. And written down, I
literally only just got that.
Written down, never got it. As soon as it was said out loud, I went, it's Rodgers and Hammerstein. How's a kid supposed to get that these 2 robots fighting future wars are actually based on people who wrote musicals for the stage?
Well, that seems, Lauren, again, the multi-layers of a world, which is, it would be very easy just to write a story where here's just the story, but it's that fact that there are, I mean, it almost makes me, when you're saying that, Ian, it reminds me of things like The Magic Roundabout, where Eric Thompson would have so many different layers, which would include references to Sergei Eisenstein. Now, it didn't matter whether you missed. As a child, when Dougal, a dog, has a camera and at one point says, "I bet this never happened to Sergei Eisenstein," I didn't immediately, as a 5-year-old, think, father, Sergei Eisenstein. But it's kind of gets embedded. And I think, Lauren, as a storyteller, do you feel that bit where you go, sometimes there's things which are not important to the story as a whole, but they just mean that you can start to feel a little bit more of that world and return to that world. And that means that as you said, like, you suddenly see Rogers and Hammerstein, you see a certain name and you have that Proustian rush as you return to the dystopia of your childhood.
I can't say I've had experienced that directly, but I will say that I brought my collection of 2000 ADs with me from the time I was 15 to 45, and they've moved across countries and continents with me. Because, and I haven't reread them in years, but those stories were so foundational and fundamental to who I was and who I am, because stories inhabit you, right? They kind of climb inside you and they colonize you and they fester and they become interesting new things. And that connection is like very real and very deep for me. And it will always be a huge part of my life. And one of the things I absolutely loved about 2000 AD was that they had really incredible female characters who weren't just sexy. Some of them were sexy. Durham Red definitely has like a lot of kind of vicious vampish sex appeal. But someone like Judge Anderson was just phenomenal and like such an empath and so brutalized by, what she experienced and what she went through, and her whole story with the Dark Judges was just absolutely phenomenal. And of course, Halo Jones, which is one of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah, Halo Jones is. And I also think of Skiz as well. Do you remember it was Skiz?
Yes, I loved Skiz.
Skiz is fantastic. Louie, what about for you? I was thinking one of the things about 2000 AD, again, we've mentioned it a couple of times, was that grit, was that the dirt of it, where science fiction, when you look at a lot of 1960s science fiction, when you look at greats, things like 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's a clean and bright world. And then we have that kind of Ridley Scott alien world, which to me, I remember when I first saw that, it felt like that was part of 2000 AD's universe. Actually, the future will still have people living mucky, horrible lives and having to eat reconstituted shit.
Yeah, I think for me with Halo Jones, it was the fact when I had one of those realization moments of the parallel with, our world, was like, oh, they're on the dole. And like the space dole still exists, and this horrific poverty and divided society, literally living on this hoop away from people. And then, the billionaires swanning in and with their fancy spaceships. So I think it was that it wasn't just the dirt, it was also the sort of social divides that really resonated, in ways that I could not articulate age 8, but I was just aware that there was just like, all the dark stuff in the world has been brought into 2000 AD, but just they've added spaceships and blaster pistols and things.
Ian, who were you most drawn to? Because I think the thing that I loved most actually was I used to love Tharg's Future Shocks. I loved Strontium Dog, but Tharg's Future Shocks, the excitement of those little, sometimes 3 or 4 page stories, the beautiful twists and the number of, again, ideas that they dealt with. What drew you? What was the first page you would turn to when you picked up 2000 AD?
I mean, pretty much anything written by Alan Moore. So the Time Twisters and the Future Shocks and stuff like that. DR and Quench was just absolutely blew me away. As storytelling as much as anything else. I was attracted to the Judge Dredd stories because they just create an extraordinary world. There was Mega City 1 was extraordinary, and the land outside the walls was extraordinary. And I just thought it was phenomenal. It was like watching Blade Runner over and over again, but with Clint Eastwood fronting it, and yes, he's a fascist, and you shouldn't be on his side, and yet somehow you are, because you understand at a deep level that there has to be order. That society needs order. If you've got chaos, then you just have rampant chaos, and anybody and everybody is after everything. But taking it to an extreme, it reminded me a lot, actually, Judge Dredd's world of A Clockwork Orange, which I hadn't been allowed to see as a kid because it was banned, or Stanley Kubrick had withdrawn it from circulation. But I'd read the book when I was 12, 13, 14. I'd read it many times. And this world that Alex, the hero, comes into, where all the thugs who he used to go around with, he comes out of incarceration and finds that they are now cops. They are now in charge of, they can do to him whatever they want, and he can't fight back. There's that extraordinary sense that you get the police that the society deserves in a way. And so this very tough policing went hand in hand with a kind of very anarchic breakdown of society. So it just seemed to be that this was maybe where Britain and elsewhere other countries were headed in the late 70s, early 80s, that we seemed to be headed towards this anarchy. And I was on the side of the anarchists as well. So when Chopper comes along and starts spray painting stuff, smiley faces everywhere, you go, yay, I don't want you to get caught. Yeah. And obviously nobody wanted Chopper to get caught, because Chopper kept coming back and mostly getting away with it.
That's it. When you were talking about that, and I was just thinking then about the different youth culture things, like the youth culture books of Richard Allen and the skinhead books and stuff, and they were basically on the side of the fascists, though. So I think, you know, which is, I mean, I wonder for you, Lauren, about looking back at those. You mentioned Strontium Dog. What now do you feel is the character that you would return to most? Because I think there is some very prescient stuff in 2000 AD.
Look, I mean, definitely Halo Jones. I love the Western aspect of Strontium Dog. I think Zenith was really interesting and really playful, and I think it broke superheroes in a really interesting way. You know, as Alan Moore did, obviously, with Watchmen. You know, I think I was never on Judge Dredd's side. I never really related to his stories. I'd often kind of, you know, they were fine. I'd buy the issues because I had to have the complete collection. But it was Judge Anderson. It was Bad Company was just absolutely phenomenal. Like the storytelling there and the ending was just devastating. And surprisingly, you know, for someone who really doesn't like war comics, oh God, I've forgotten the name. Thank you, Road Trooper. I was thinking Rogue One. I'm like, that is not correct. Completely different story. But yeah, so Road Trooper, I thought like did war very, very well. And I thought the last season of Halo Jones did war very well, and Bad Company as well. I think maybe it was because I was living under a fascist state and a racist state where poor people were ruthlessly suppressed, that maybe Judge Dredd didn't feel as fun. Although it was cool when he went out into, you know, the Badlands.
Yeah, it's funny because I think I thought of Judge Dredd as a victim of the system, whereas I think now as an adult, I don't. I think if you're complicit in the system, you're not a victim. But I was like, well, they cloned him. It wasn't his fault. You know, he had to do this. But I was just thinking about like characters that I like now versus then. And I think Nemesis, I've always liked what Nemesis looks like, but I think as a character now and as what he stands for means a lot more to me now as an adult.
Yeah,
thinking about what it means to sort of fight against like a radicalized group, which, you know, could be anything, but I don't know, looking now is like transphobes, but you know, there's whatever group it is, it applies to anything. And what it means to be pure, because I think kind of that idea of purity is something that's so interesting. Once you kind of get into your like muddy middle age where, you know, everything's complicated, there's no simple lines anymore. Well, not for me. The danger of purity, and also I guess always identifying with the deviant. That's what I did enjoy that as a kid, and I enjoy that now in a slightly different way.
Well, also the art, sorry Robin, the art was just like nothing I'd ever seen before. Like the character design in Nemesis was just so strange and bizarre.
Yeah, it was always a toss-up for me whether I was going to draw Judge Dredd or Nemesis. I thought it drew them on equal, you know, obsessiveness.
You were touching on that there, Louie, as well, about, you know, I think for a lot of us, when we look back at 2000 AD and some of the other things as well of science fiction, it was an introduction to ideas, certainly for my generation, I think, ideas of a counterculture, because I'm not old enough to have really been in you know, that when counterculture was a more dominant thing, and also that bit of being an outsider kid, something like 2000 AD, in a way that Victor comic was not, or Whizzer and Chips, or whatever it might have been. 2000 AD started to create, to me, I think, a code for some of the other kids that you would then find yourself hiding in that corner of the playground talking about that. And I think those things, and things like Doctor Who as well, do seem to be such a lifeline for young people who feel that they are not part of the mainstream. Louie?
Yeah, I mean, I think I suppose like Doctor Who is the like nice version where everything can end okay, whereas 2000 AD it's really not gonna. But at the same time, yes, it's definitely the outsider as the main character always, which is fascinating. And I mean, I used to read, as well as read my dad's pile of 2000 ADs, had The Eagle as well, kind of going back to the 60s. And with that, I think it was the art that I loved. It's absolutely, that was stunning, painterly stuff. But the ethics was always really off-putting because it was this very kind of colonialist Boy Scout. We're just going to turn to this planet and make it okay, or kill everyone. So 2000 AD, I felt like ethical truth in a different way.
Tonally, 2000 AD was really interesting because some of the comics we've spoken about that came before it the tone was the same all the way through. If the Bash Street Kids seem to have a very similar vibe to Dennis the Menace, had a very similar vibe to Desperate Dan or whatever. You came at 2000 AD, one story would be a harsh dystopia set in the future. The next story could be quite fun. It could be Sam Slade, Robo Hunter, which is based on kind of, noir stories, but done with a very light touch with his Robo Stogie that talks back to him and stuff. Ace Trucking Company with Freak the Freak, just absolutely gorgeous, great illustrations, great art, but also really fun, light storytelling. And so there was you turn the page and it'd be a story that was completely different in feel to the story you just finished. And so it was asking quite a lot of you as a reader. It was saying, are you able to take these sudden switches from this kind of storytelling to that kind of storytelling? And of course, you are then going to have your favorites because they were very different. Every issue had this real selection box element to it. And I liked all of it, including the Curly Wurly.
It was interesting. My dad he threw away my collection of Misty comics, which was the horror comic for girls.
Yeah.
But he didn't touch my 2000 ADs. And I think he was, I think he missed a thing there because I think 2000 AD was much more dangerous and subversive.
Did you think the Misty would be like witchcraft or something?
Yeah, like satanic-y.
Oh, yeah. It was a bit, right?
Yeah, no, totally. There was absolutely an episode or an issue where, Satan took control of the girls' school.
Well, that's it. The Misty stuff. I mean, it's interesting. Even Bunty, actually, I bought a bunch of Bunty albums when I was at annuals when I was in Southwold a few months back, and they had much more intricate stories than a lot of the ones that were meant for boys at the time. Some of very. There's one adventure all about a girl who's not only got a pet griffin, but it's also invisible. And it's works on something, but this is this brings the girls' school thing brings me to one of the points I want to talk a little bit about, which is about class in 2000 AD, because I know that it's something that Alan Moore's talked about and some of the other writers and artists as well, which is a lot of the comics they were brought up on in the 50s and 60s were about people in kind of boarding schools, and it was a lot of it was nice middle class and upper middle class people with horses. And then you get this, around the time, some of the American comics, and then also 2000 AD, suddenly it seems to be a much broader tableau of the people who are the heroes, the villains, and part of that story. That it seems to break out from some of the class, restrictions that we might have seen in some comic books. I don't know, Lauren, if you noticed that at all.
Definitely, so I did read Bunty and I want to say Ginty, but there were a bunch of British girls comics that we could get, but a lot of them were about horses or ballet classes. And even when there was a cool murder mystery attached to the ballet, I was like, I don't care about ballet. And look, I went, I did not have 2000 AD as a marker as a way into another friendship group because I went to an all girls private school. I went to Rodin, Johannesburg. So I was living that kind of private girls' school life, and I think that made me more of a freak than an outcast. And I think that made 2000 AD just such a lifeline for me as this kind of like weirdo and finding stories which really spoke to me. But yeah, I think it does tackle class in really interesting ways. I think there are working class heroes. I think the way it deals with society and Judge Dredd does that very well. The fascism works because the society is so fundamentally broken, and it's such a reflection of real society back then and now and heading towards the future, that I really think it was much more interesting than a lot of those other stories, which were very gentrified and very kind of genteel and proper.
And I think with 2000 AD, even if it's not actively dealing with class, what it does is it centers working class heroes as though that's just obvious. That's who's always going to be the hero. So obviously, Hayden Jones is the hero, you know.
Exactly.
And I think, I mean, because 2000 AD was my way into comics, so I don't really have that sort of. I didn't have the before. I just had the after. I just had the punk. But I did later read some of the other stuff. I guess I read The Eagle as well, but I was quite aware that The Eagle was from a long time ago. So I don't think I judged it by the same standards. You know, a bit like when you watch black and white films with your parents or something, you'd just be like, well, that was another time. So I'll put it in a different box. But I guess all the children's books I probably read at the same time would have been the, you know, Narnia and stuff that had your very well-to-do children. Apart from Jan Mark, who I don't know, is sadly quite forgotten now, but she was big in the 80s when I was a kid. And she always wrote some really good kind of working class heroes. In, you know, her books were set in like state secondary schools. It was very much about, you know, a girl who's into football and likes shouting at people. You know, but it was rare. It was definitely rare. And I think 2000 AD brought that as well, where it did kind of felt like it wasn't operating in a safe, weird Edwardian bubble that so much of children's books does. And I think, you know, children's books to an extent still does that, and not everywhere, but I think there is that weird nostalgia for, I don't know, like 1890 to 1920, where it's sort of children's bookland, you know, not the real time. Because obviously like historical fiction is slightly different. It's more that when fantasy is aimed at children, often it's like, everything's made of clockwork, and we weirdly wear Victorian clothes for no reason in this parallel fantasy world with the unicorns, you know. So yeah, 2000 AD is that kind of, I guess it's that antidote that's, you know, I guess I had it before the poison, but it's still an antidote, you know.
I mean, there's no doubt for me that, you know, as a working class kid, that comics were the gateway drug to literature, the gateway drug to all kinds of stories. But also they were a gateway for writers and artists. Anybody could rock up, it seemed to me, at 2000 AD offices in London and get a job. I mean, you know, they were very welcoming to new and young writers and gave them a chance, gave them a break. Mark Millar, I think, just started sending them stuff. I wish I'd had the guts to do it. If I'd had the guts to start sending them stuff, I might now be a comic book writer and not a jobbing novelist with all the glamour that the comic book writer has around him. You know, I could be Neil Gaiman, Mark II, Neil Gaiman 2.0. I could be.
I think though you are using the example of someone who does have that glamour life. I think there's a lot of other comic book writers going, tell you what, I wish I'd gone into that. Based around
most of the comic book writers watching this are crying.
Yeah.
Well, I wondered, Ian, when you were reading 2000 AD, so where did it, you know, was it a springboard into? Had you been into science fiction, for instance, before, or was this the start of looking at any of that world, and you know, maybe the world of people like Philip K. Dick or Ursula K. Le Guin?
You know what? It wasn't, Robin. It didn't. You know, I've never been a big reader of science fiction and fantasy in book form. I hate to say it, but it's true. Loved the films, loved the TV shows. But I just, you know, I just used to have this conversation a lot with Ian M. Banks. He called his science fiction novel Skiffy. And I said, I've tried your Skiffy books, and I just can't. There's something blocking me from enjoying these stories. Although I loved hanging out with Ian Banks, and I read all these non sci-fi books. 2000 AD, you know, just led me to other comics. So when the British writers trampolined from 2000 AD and other comics to America and started working for DC and Vertigo and Marvel and everybody else, I went with them. And by this time I was married and living in Tottenham in London, and it had a comic shop. It had an actual comic shop, and I would go in there. I remember the guy who ran it saying to me, "You'll love this, issue 1 Watchmen. It's Alan Moore." I went, "Oh, and bring it on," because I'd been reading his Swamp Thing stuff. So, you know, that took me to Swamp Thing, took me to everything that Mark Millar was going to produce, and all these other great writers and artists were going to produce, the Dave McKeans of this world and everybody else. So I liked British storytellers. I liked British artists. And even when I went to America, I think they had a bigger effect on America than America had on their style. So American comics became a lot edgier. Okay, they already had The Dark Knight, but they became a lot edgier because of all these British writers and artists who were bringing their stuff with them. And so that was where it eventually led me. I should say, on my wedding, my wife still holds this up to me. On my wedding day, when she was getting her hair done, I was off getting 2000 AD, because it was the day that 2000 AD was published. I had to go and get 2000 AD and read it before I got my morning suit on to go to the church to get married. My wife is furious about that 30 odd years on.
So you were still reading it as you walked down the aisle. I can see that would be
pretty much
annoying.
Rolled up in my pocket in my jacket, you know.
Sorry, it's I
The
do
ring
not
pulls
Borat
out the
film.
2000 AD.
What about the new influence for you, Lauren? You know, once you started reading 2000 AD, was that a springboard into other areas of kind of writing that you hadn't looked at before?
So my mom got me into fantasy, my dad got me into science fiction. So, you know, I read Dragonlance and ElfQuest, but then I also read a lot of Philip K. Dick, Ursula Le Guin. So I think I was already very much kind of in that mode, but I don't know if I would have been a comic writer if it hadn't been for 2000 AD. And I think it really gave me an understanding of what you could do with storytelling. And South African theatre did this very well as well, because we had a lot of sanctions and we also had censorship. We weren't allowed to tackle things directly. You weren't allowed to talk about how evil the apartheid government was and, hey, maybe we shouldn't force people to live in a racist state. So people in theatre, people used a lot of kind of analogs and, you know, mythology or fables as a way of kind of exploring actually what apartheid was doing. And I thought 2000 AD reflected that so well as well. And I was like, oh, this is a way of getting at reality in a really interesting and engaging way, is through allegory, is through parable, and putting this kind of science fiction twist or this, you know, alternate reality twist on what already exists. And that's absolutely fed into my novels, from Zoo City, which is, you know, about a magical Johannesburg, to The Shining Girls, which is about a time traveling serial killer, but it's really about the mistakes we make in history, which come up again and again, and how we talk about femicide, and what femicide is and what it does to us socially as a society and on a personal level. But if I'd written a book about femicide, which some of my friends have done, you know, hardcore nonfiction, you don't reach the same kind of audience. And it's that kind of the Trojan horse of sneaking in like a really potent, powerful message and using your art to say something about the world, but having, you know, robots and, you know, electronic cigars and a war out in space.
Well, that's, I mean, Louie, I find that very interesting about the, to me, science fiction and the kind of worlds that 2000 AD introduced me to. Many of the, especially the shorter strips, are thought experiments. You know, that they can be used so easily by people trying to, you know, go, I need to popularize my philosophy lecture. How can I do it? Hang on a minute. I've just found this time twister. I've just found this particular Judge Dredd. This deals with, you know, they do seem to me to have introduced us also to a little kind of philosophical ideas and ways of exploring. Louie, I just want to...
Oh, that's me. Sorry. Yeah, no, I think it's true. And I particularly like those kind of future shock time twisters ones. I like when I'm writing, I really do like writing about ethics, but I'm also very aware that that could, you know, make someone yawn pretty quickly, especially if they're 8. So going at it via a what if. So like my book about Loki is, what if Loki was turned into an 11-year-old boy and had to live on Earth as a mortal child with all the kind of humiliations that involves, and had to try and become a better person. What would that look like? So I guess it's asking, what does it mean to be a good person, and how do you go about doing that while life is quite hard? And I can't imagine sort of sitting down to a group of 8-year-olds and saying, so, you know, what is the good life? Let's talk about Aristotle. But I think doing that through the lens of a god was an exciting, you know, exploration for me, just as you might explore it through the lens of a future fascist or a girl who just went out.
Lauren, can I ask you what you wrote for 2000 AD for the 40th anniversary edition? What was your story for the 40th anniversary edition?
It was a Strontium Dog story, but we kind of quite heavily centered Durham Red, and we were riffing off, we named the bad guy for King Leopold, who just absolutely devastated the Congo. You know, he cut off people's hands, and in the rubber trade, it was just awful slavery and murder. So it was kind of like a neo-colonial revenge story, where it seems like Durham Red's actually trying to protect someone, but maybe she's betraying them, but maybe she's also trying to bag this big fish of, you know, this alien who's been completely exploiting a planet. And you know, Johnny Alpha's also there. But Durham was when I was excited to write.
Ian,
Can we get
who-
hold of this somewhere? I'd love to read it.
Yeah, it's part of the 45th anniversary, but I can also send you the PDF. I mean, I can't. I definitely would not do that.
No.
No.
I'll get the issue.
Ian, who would you have written for then? You said you never sent anything to the mystical place of Kingsreach Tower, wasn't it? That was
Yeah.
Isn't that strange? When you actually eventually saw it as an adult, and it was such a mystical place, and then you realised it was just people scurrying through their NMEs and Melody Maker upstairs and 2000 AD over there.
Yeah.
That sounds magical.
Yeah, of course it's magical, because it's what's happening inside all these people's heads is the real place. It's not the physical building, it's what's happening inside it and all the people that are in there. Same as with same as with NME and stuff. Well, I eventually did get the call. I got the call, but I got it, many years later. Somebody from Vertigo Comics, DC Vertigo in New York said, in interviews, you keep saying what a huge fan of comic books you are and stuff like, have you ever thought about writing one? And I went, what took you so long, guys? By this stage, I was well into my 40s, if not my 50s. And so I started pitching ideas. And the one that they liked was for a 200-page standalone with John Constantine Hellblazer. So I did a 200-page standalone. That was my first ever comic. And, a steep learning curve. Because the only script page I'd ever seen was one written by Alan Moore. And he's very peculiar in the amount of detail he puts into his scripts. And I thought that's how you do it. So I did it that way. And I learned a lesson, which is you don't need to put in all that detail. Give the artist, cut them a little bit slack, give them some leeway. But it was great. And I was working with Werther Della Idrea, who's become very big, very hot recently. He did the art for it, but I never met him. Never spoke to him. It was all done. He was in, Italy, Spain. I was in Edinburgh. The editor was in New York, and it all passed via the editor. So, but I think Werther's working now with James Tinian on Something is Killing the Children and stuff like that. So he did all right. It was one of his first comics, was this 200-page Constantine. I remember when it arrived, and I got very excited, and it's in black and white. I thought it was going to be in color. And it was in black and white, and I went, But apart from that, it was fine.
Louie, what about, in terms of the storytelling style? I always think that with your books, they manage to be both concise and fabulous. That kind of, which is what a comic so often has to be, is to try and manage to encase so much of a story in so few words and so few images. And I think you managed to very often, Loki, which as I said, I've only just started on now. But there's so many images that you just create in people's heads. So you're still obviously working in images. I wondered how the comic style, whether it has actually influenced the way that you approach writing for young people.
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in both like straight up comics, strip stuff, but also where you get into that hybrid space. So something like Posey Simmons, where you will have, she'll kind of there'll be a letter on the page, and then there'll be a bit of comic strip and a pastiche of 18th century art. And I really enjoy the kind of exploring that sort of, I guess, the physicality of a book, which I think I'm very aware of when I'm reading a comic. It is an object, not just, sometimes if you're reading just text, sometimes it's like the words are going into your brain, but not necessarily that much mediated by the book. Whereas with the comic, I'm quite aware of the book. So I like thinking of kind of the Loki book, say, it's like almost like a medieval manuscript with the illuminations, and you've got the text and the images interacting, and then some straight up comic strips, but also kind of lots of labels everywhere. Because I like, that's kind of how I think. I like that like messy, very kind of spatial thinking, like a bit like the narrative equivalent of the murder board, where you have everything's a spider diagram. But I think also the in 2000 AD, I think it was very good at this, that kind of everything's very concise, because if you're going to have an issue that has multiple stories in it, and to get you to kind of switch from one to the other, and each story is only a part of a story, you really have to get to the point quite quickly. There's none of that kind of rambling, self-indulgent, let's just have a page of a character staring into the distance and then pulling on their, boots, except in the one story where he pulls on his boots, and that's the significant moment. But generally it's very kind of bam, bam, bam. And also the dialogue is what really lifted 2000 AD for me. It's just all these funny people saying funny things to each other, in great peril and while being shot at. Sinister and Dexter always had the best kind of banter, I think.
Lauren, what about, do you feel that it's an advantage or a disadvantage to be stuck in what is technically described as genre writing? With Ian as well, it's still seen that people who write kind of, crime thrillers and people who write science fiction and people who write horror, it's a kind of in a different corner of the bookshop, and maybe you have to order some of that stuff as well. And I think that gives it also a great advantage in terms of where you can go, that there's something exciting. But do you feel that it would be better if these things were more embraced as just being mixed with all the other books and not in their own special section?
Well, I think we should, I mean, literary is its own genre. So are rom-coms and ladlit and chicklit, and, the idea that there is fiction and then crime and science fiction and horror is ridiculous. Like, we're all intermingled, and and as soon as like a literary writer, like someone like Colson Whitehead, suddenly gets into genre, it's like this kind of groundbreaking, amazing, wow, he's like really, slumming it. It's like, no, the genre is like where the exciting ideas happen. And I think what genre does so very well is explore the fractal lines of society. And I think crime does that very well. Noir, horror, absolutely. And science fiction and fantasy as well. Like, we really kind of get into the nitty gritty of things. And again, I think it comes down to personal choice. For me, I find it very liberating. For me, I find it's very exciting space to play in. But I do want to pick up on writing for 2000 AD when it was 1996, I think, and I was backpacking around the world, and I was in England, and I was just about to go home to South Africa, and a job ad came up that for 2000 AD to be a writer. And I so desperately wanted to go for it, and I was way too intimidated. And I was like, oh, but my visa is about to run out and I have to go home. And I wonder what that reality would have been like if I'd actually, cowgirled up and gone through and followed that up. That would have been really cool.
Ian, how do you feel about still that kind of sense of the called genre writing? And it's like with Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood, a lot of people will say they try and pretend that she doesn't write a lot of science fiction because she's now, considered so literary. And of course, she just writes great stories. And it happens that a lot of them are within what we would consider to be a science fiction world. Are you glad to still be perhaps slightly, I mean, I know obviously you're a best-selling author, but in some ways still the reviews, we don't seem to have as many reviews as a lot of the kind of stuff that's considered to be genre. It doesn't seem to have, it doesn't get spoken about in such highfalutin ways.
I think it used to bother me a lot more than it does now, because back in the bad old days when I started writing crime fiction definitely wasn't taken seriously in the UK, but crime fiction is taken a lot more seriously in the UK now, and other kinds of writing still are looked down on. So the historical novel, the romance novel, women's fiction, science fiction, horror are still looked down on. In a way that crime isn't, and I'm just hoping everybody else gets a rung up the ladder, the same as crime has happened with crime. Now, crime novels, you can study them sometimes in high school, definitely in universities, they're on various syllabuses, etc. And literary novelists, Colson's been mentioned, will write crime fiction, when they get the ideas. And I mean, that's what happens with me, is I get the idea for the story first, or the theme that I want to explore, and then I think, what kind of story will allow me to explore this? And almost always I think, well, this sounds to me like it could be a crime novel, and mostly it's featuring the same character. Not always, but mostly. But that's because the story, that's just the best way of telling that story. And if I got an idea for a story that couldn't be contained in a crime novel, I would write that story. But I don't think things are nearly as bad for crime fiction as they were a generation or two ago. And part of that is down to the fact that young writers have come along who see no shame in writing crime fiction. A generation ago, they would have wanted to be thought of as literary novelists. And now it doesn't bother them in the least. They would rather have the sales than the review in the Times Literary Supplement.
And Louie, I was just thinking that there's a Marvel universe which is, just seems to be churning out an enormous, spin-off after spin-off. There's the DC universe. We haven't yet got a kind of 2000 AD cinematic universe. Obviously, we've had a reasonably terrible version of Judge Dredd in the 90s, and then what I personally thought was a pretty good Judge Dredd movie in the last 10 years.
In South Africa.
Yeah,
it's a perfect place to do it.
What did you think of that movie, Lauren?
No, I thought it was great. I thought it was really fun, and yeah. And my friend Joe died in it, as he does in every movie.
Is that his job?
He's an actor, and he somehow ends up dying. He's died in God, I can't remember any name. Starship Troopers 3. He's died in Black Sails. He's died in Judge Dredd. He at least got a named death in Judge Dredd, but yeah.
But he only dies in really good films, though. That's
yes,
good.
no, absolutely. Like, well, yes, some. I don't know about Starship Troopers.
He's the Sean Bean of his generation.
Yeah, exactly.
As long as your death makes the edit, that's the main thing. But who would you, Louis? If you were now someone said, right, we've got 2000 AD universe. It's time that we started to make movies. Where is the screenplay for you? Which person are you going to think? Right, this is the story we need to.
I've got to go Halo Jones. I want a big budget for the Clara Pandy.
Yeah.
I want a really scary robot dog. This is not going to be a family movie. It's going to be quite gross, but it's also going to be, you know, reflecting the modern day society. And I want a really big, like, energetic kind of dance score. I think, like, a really kind of, like, really dirty, something you would like listen to at 4 a.m. in an underground club. I haven't been clubbing for a while, but I imagine. And I basically want every 13-year-old to want to be her.
So that you're going to make the movie where you go, you won't believe it, Alan Moore actually liked my film of his work. I always have that image of like the guy who made that terrible League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and I've heard from some of the people who were on set at the time about, you know, and I'd imagine that when he first sat down, he thought, I'm going to be the one that's going to make the movie that Alan, and then slowly go, this is not going very well at all. And, oh man, so what about for you, Ian? What's going to be your first 2000 AD universe screenplay?
Sam Slade. It's got to be. I mean, you know, update the gumshoe. Get all the elements of Blade Runner, but with a lot of laughs. So the kids will love it. I'm reminded though. I've got the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I've got a story about that because I once was invited to meet Sean Connery because he wanted me to ghost his autobiography. And I thought, right, Ian, you're meeting Sean Connery. Take a DVD, get him to sign a DVD. And in my rush to leave, the first thing I found was League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the film that basically ended his career. He did after that, no more movies. And I took it along, and I said, "Oh, by the way, Sean, can you?" He went, "We're fucking." The director was a madman, an absolute madman. The director. And but he signed it to me, and I probably that is the only signed copy of that film in existence, because I doubt Sean wanted to sign too many of those.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's such a we won't need to talk about that film anymore. Lauren, what about for you? So which are you entering the 2000?
Well, I think Louis and I are going to have to collaborate on Halo.
Excellent.
I think I did have some talks a couple of years ago about it. But what I think for me would be a really important thing now is I would like Halo to be a woman of color, you know, a young queer woman. And I think that I just feel that would be like a much better update of who she is, and speak more to where we are in society right now. But yeah, and yeah, but you need a huge budget, and it'd be so interesting to like track her whole life. Yeah.
Just saying, Lux Rothchop as a woman would be quite hot.
Oh yes. Now I'm trying to cast her.
Yeah.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of people leaving comments afterwards to give you
the one thing everyone goes away with.
What about the renaming 2000 AD? Because the thing I was thinking, my son was born in 2007, and when he really got into comics, I was in a Reading and Oxfam, and I found some old 2000 ADs, and I took them back to him, and his first reaction was, "But that was ages ago, Dad." And I think it's quite an interesting thing that, you know, for us, we can still see 2000 AD as just this idea of a future. But for him, as certainly when he was 10 years old, this was a very strange idea that a future comic set so far in the past. So have we any thoughts of, because that's always what you always think when you watch those movies, which go, it's 1997 and Manhattan has been turned into it, and you go, always starting the screenplay, it's the near future.
Yeah.
The near future is always a little bit. So have we got any ideas for the rename of 2000 AD for those kids who are feeling it's a historical examination?
I was just wondering though, if it might just become a word. You know how like the save icon is a disc and no one knows what that is anymore. It's almost like it's just, I don't know, it's a word, but it doesn't have to mean the year. It just becomes a symbol of something magical and exciting.
I'm sure they went through. I'm sure they've been through this. I'm sure 2000 AD, the editorial staff have thought many times, do we need to rebrand? I mean, 2000 AD, to start with, was twinned with another comic. It was kind of two comics, and it kept blending in with other comics and the best characters from other comics. And that used to happen all the time when I was young. That one week you'd be buying Whizzer, the next week it was Whizzer and Chips, and two comics had become one. And just the best elements of both were kept there. And I think it's to 2000 AD's credit that it's kept the brand, that 2000 AD still means something. When you say the word, the image it conjures up is still relevant. Although 2000 AD, the year might be a long way in the past, 2000 AD as a brand still means something relevant. And it pertains because of that. It hasn't been swamped by other comics because it is such a strong brand.
What was it? It wasn't Star-Lord, was it? What was the...
Yep.
It was,
and Warrior and
yeah. So that it was 2000 AD and Star-Lord when it started. That was the God, I've forgotten that.
I'm just thinking about it. I hadn't thought about it previously, but just off the top of my head, maybe 0 AD, or just.
But it's interesting.
But that would read OAD, and that would not.
But you're right. There is something about 2000 AD becomes in a space in the block universe that is this kind of uncanny space, doesn't it? It's this space which allows it to be. It's like when you watch an old spaghetti western where they didn't have enough of the budget to build anything beyond 3 houses, and therefore suddenly it just every town becomes a ghost town. Every returning gunfighter becomes the ghost of a gunfighter, whether it's as deliberate as High Plains Drifter. And I think that's what I see as 2000 AD. That bit of time in the block universe where it sits is this mystical time of what the future was to be and always what it was to be. So the final thing, what would you like 2000 AD to explore? What areas in terms of science fiction, in terms of kind of the future possibilities, or indeed using the future possibilities to explore the past? What areas would you like to see 2000 AD going into in the next 45 years?
So I think they should ask me to guest edit an African issue where we just find amazing African writers and tell stories from the continent.
That's very interesting. Louie?
I would like... it's a tricky one. I'm still really interested in like deep space and finding other worlds. So I'd love to do, special edition on life on other worlds, in our distant future. What would the human race be like when it's spread out across the galaxy, or what happens to the people that are left?
Ian?
Well, I mean, various stories down the years have dealt with ecology, but it's more important now than ever, and especially if we can get to younger readers and say to them, by the way, we fucked up, and you're going to have to clean it up, please. And here's a story that's going to give you some ideas that will tell you you've got a problem, but maybe it's not insurmountable, although it's getting that way. So something that isn't totally dystopian, but actually gives a little bit of hope for the generations coming along after us would be nice.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Louie. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, everyone. I hope there's loads more stuff coming up for the 45th anniversary of 2000 AD. It is right. How many of you, let's just check, right? We talked about this before we went on air. How many of you returned home one day and found out that your box of comics had been thrown away by your mum or your dad then? Ian?
My big sister, she'd given them to her friends. All her friends had taken them away.
Louie?
I don't know what happened to them. They're just gone somewhere. So I know they've gone to a farm upstate to play with all the other 2000 ADs.
So some kind of wormhole connection to the farms as well. And Lauren, you said before that there was a preservation for yours.
Yeah, so my dad threw out my Misties, but I've been traveling with my 2000 AD collection, which went from 1987 to I think 1997. So like 10 years worth for 30 years. I have whittled it down to my favorites. I got rid of a lot of the Dredds that I didn't like, but I've still got about 50 comics, which I put in a container and I shipped from South Africa to London 3 months ago. So yeah.
I'm going to throw one more actually quickly. 2000 AD cover. When I say that, what's the first one that you see?
Nemesis.
Nemesis. Louie?
Dark Judges.
Ian?
Yeah, just a big, huge Judge Dredd on his motorbike.
What was
and the Judge Cal story as well.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good one. Thank you very much. Now, everyone who hasn't had their 2000D thrown away, go and enjoy them and realize what a wonderful world that you have that was...
Go and look on eBay and see how much they're worth.
Ooh.
yeah, that's...
Scary.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, Louie, and Ian.